I had specialized in apologetics. And so I was kind of prepared to tell people about the arguments for God, the science. But that doesn't really resonate in Japan.
Well, this is an exciting conversation we have in store. This is a things hidden discussion, audio only because of travel constraints. But we did wanted to do this because we wanted to have a returning guest join us, and that is Paul Axton of the Forging Plowshares podcast. He's also a minister and missionary in his career, and someone who has taught theology. He's got a lot of different hats he wears, but I'm so glad to have you on, Paul.
Good to be here. Glad to talk.
Yeah, and it's also great to have our friend and writer at A Neighbor's Choice. He's the editor of aneighborschoice.com. Surit Dasgupta join us. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing fine. Thanks for inviting me, and it's an honor to be here with Dr. Paul Axton.
But we could
Feelings mutual.
could you give us a little introduction for folks who maybe have missed? I've done my last conversation with you was a few years ago when we were just discussing how we kind of forgot some of the details of what we talked about, but we have reconnected in recent times, and I just wanted to have you on to kind of explore further some of the themes of sacrifice in Japan and Christianity and some of these other interesting topics that I think are increasingly becoming interested for a variety of people.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I right now am the director of Forging Plowshares, which is the umbrella ministry. And in that, then we do podcasts, put out blogs, but we also then have Plowshares Bible Institute, where we do a seminary level education. And I think it's a pretty, I did seminary, so I'm pretty well familiar with what it consists of. And I think we're doing something deeper than the usual seminary education. And so we have online classes, 8-week classes that people can join. We recently had Jordan Wood did a class for us last year. Tony Bartlett just finished a class. Jonathan Heaps did a class on Lonergan. So and then I teach also. So we have the seminary level education that's going. And then I am also a preacher, a little country church. I'm a country preacher. And but my wife and I and our children, we lived in Japan for more than 20 years. And I ran a school in Japan. Actually, I did very similar things in Japan. I ran a school there and was a preacher at a church, a little church there. So I just kind of transferred my what I'm doing from there. But yeah, that's a bit of my background.
That's similar to my father was a preacher and a teacher as well, so he would always have some kind of school he was involved with, or later on he was the principal of a school, but he always had a little church and a little school he was involved with. So I'm glad to know that we have a kindred spirit here. And where was it? Where did you spend most of your time in Japan for folks interested in that?
Well, my wife's family, her father was there all of his life. He's her and his mother, or her mother, and they're both buried there. And they were there from 1950 until they passed away. And then her brother was there, is still there in Kagoshima. So we did a year replacing, or my brother-in-law came on furlough in Kagoshima, and then after that year we located in a place north of Tokyo called Ibaraki. And if you it's a new town, actually, which is very unusual. I think there's only two of them in Japan, but it's a planned city, but it's a science city, a research city, university town. And so we spent all of our time there. And then I preached in a church in Tsuchiura, which was very close to Tsukuba. And then we started the school in Tokyo, uh, in Higashi Nakano. We were just a one stop away from Shinjuku Station, which is the world's busiest train station.
Wow. So you were in the thick of it there.
We were in the thick of it. I commuted into Tokyo 4 days a week.
So did you like the big city or did you prefer the smaller town environment in Japan? Because I know a lot of the cities in Japan that are small are still kind of big compared to the average American town, right?
Yeah, scuba is a little unusual. In by Japan standards, we were actually in the country in that we were on the edge of town in Scuba, and we lived in a farm community, actually. But it's not that way anymore. It's now developed. And so we enjoyed the life there in Scuba. It wasn't quite so hectic. It's a very orderly, everything in Japan is orderly, but Scuba was especially so. It's laid out in a grid pattern. So everything's north south. And if you go into Tokyo, you never know where the streets may be taking you. So we liked scuba, but I liked being in Tokyo. I don't think I would have liked living in Tokyo, but it was not too bad, commuting in and doing that. Now I say all that. I went back just last year to Japan, and I had a very it's you get a very different impression just visiting Japan. And actually, I found on my visit Tokyo to be very hectic. But I didn't. When you're just there and you're going in every day, and I benefited from both the huge city and the smaller town.
How did you pick out where you wanted to put your school in Tokyo? I mean, that's a vast, what are we at, 30 million people there in that metro area?
Yeah, I think it depends on how you count. If you count in Yokohama and it used to be Mexico City had exceeded Tokyo, but I think actually Tokyo may have now. So it's maybe the world's largest city. But we located us at a school that our group, Christian churches, had run a Bible college there after the war, and then it had closed. And so there was a building and there were funds available. And so we located in Higashi Nakano because that church and building were there. All started by a pre-war, or rather a post-war, or rather he was there in the 1930s. One of our earliest missionaries who had bought a lot of property. And so the Yotsuya Mission was the name of it. And they provided the building and the funding and helped us get started. And then we made a partnership with a school in Tennessee, in Johnson City, Tennessee, Milligan College, that we would send, our students would go begin in Japan and they would finish their education in the United States.
What was your favorite class to teach there in Tokyo area?
Well, that's a hard one. It's kind of funny because, of course, most of the classes were pretty basic because we were teaching Bible and basic theology and things in English to prepare them to come to the States. But while I was there, I also began to teach graduate level classes to missionaries and actually, I had a guy from Palestine, various people, and I enjoyed the upper level classes uh, more. and I did classes on Japan in Japan, interestingly, and but also on philosophy and theology. And I think I enjoyed those the most.
So everyone in your class was a pretty lifelong Christian or recent converts too, or how did that work? Were they?
Well, at the graduate level, they were for the most part. I mentioned the guy in Palestine. He was on his way to the United States, but he was a new convert. But the others, I had a fellow that was a missionary, and actually he was a Nisei. That is, his parents were Japanese, but he was American. Uh, but at the undergraduate level, our Japanese students, most of them were Christians, but not all of them. So we had some that either were new Christians or were not Christians. So it was a mixed group.
And did you find it? Did you find any stumbling blocks for them intellectually or morally in wrapping their minds around the things that you were trying to explain to them about the Christian worldview? Was there something that was easier than other things to get across, and then surprisingly harder, or how did that work?
Well, of course, David, this is kind of my story that because of my experience there, and over a period of time, I began my own theology began to shift and change from what I would call a guilt-based American Christianity and mentality to recognizing that actually shame was more clearly appropriate, not just to Japan, but I think to Scripture. And that then unfolded a very different theological understanding. So if you ask me how, or, it's a little hard for me to locate that because maybe I'm just a little slow. But yeah, I think that I began to recognize that the gospel, as I had understood it, was first of all, it didn't necessarily make a lot of sense. A typical approach in this country, and I had specialized in apologetics. And so I was kind of prepared to tell people about the arguments for God, the science. But that doesn't really resonate in Japan. In fact, I think it just sort of confuses things. But it took me a long time to recognize that and to recognize that what is needed, and I think what in fact is the topic, the subject of Scripture, is more of a personal deliverance and transformation that is not so much rule based, guilt oriented, but more focused on a holistic understanding both of the human problem or predicament and of the resolution to that problem in Christ.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Just to deviate for a second, but maybe this can help us. Is I listened to some of your thoughts, and Surit, please jump in whenever you want to. But I know you're listening along, but please come
Yeah.
in whenever you want to. But I heard one of your podcasts you did on forging plowshares about the limitations of the Kalam argument as presented by someone like William Lane Craig, who's most famous. It's one of his most famous arguments that he uses. And you talk about the way that you approach things, which I thought was just refreshingly simple, which is, well, the Kalam argument does not really, it tries to make a case for God devoid of Christ. And if we're going to have a true understanding of God, it must be in keeping with the divine logos and the implications of how Christ actually, is, this idea of trying to intellectually make models of God's existence apart from Christ is a kind of betrayal of the Christian project. If you think about it, I thought, wow, that's so simple and so true. So, you
Yeah.
know, I can imagine that kind of taps into what you're getting at when you talk about, traditional apologetics not being very persuasive to the Japanese, but rather holistic transformations.
Yeah, with the Kalam argument it betrays the same problems that we always encounter. And that is that what, somebody like William Lane Craig overlooks and what his critics have pointed out. Well, even in there has to be a point in time in the way that Craig does the Kalam argument, in which there is a change or a shift in God. In other words, it's not actually a smooth argument as it unfolds. To make it's always the same problem. It's the problem of the one and the many in Plato and Aristotle, which this all sounds very abstract and strange. But of course, the way that we experience this as human beings is we feel an alienation. We feel that this thing that is a philosophical problem that shows forth in these various philosophical arguments actually is reflective of the problem that we all have. And that is that it's not just that the philosophical arguments don't hold together, but I don't hold together. In other words, it's not a separate issue. And the recognition then of how it is that Christ is the resolution to the problem of the creator and the creation. That sounds like that is a bit abstract putting it that way. But of course, when you state it personally, that the way that Paul puts it, that we are the letters of Christ, that in him we live and move and have our being, that he is becoming all in all. Then we don't have the alienation problem that I think is very much predominant in Japan. Just there is this sphere of the private and the sphere of the public, and the two things really in a Japanese understanding you never really are supposed to expose the private, that you're so concerned with Tatemae, or the public presentation, and honne. Well, think of Immanuel Kant's distinction between the phenomena and the noumena. He's just stating philosophically the thing that I think we all recognize. How do we fit together our inside and our outside? How, in Paul's language, I do what I don't want to do, and what I don't want to do, I do that. And so there's this split. And so my tendency, I don't know if is just to illustrate that I think that, and I meant that failure. In other words, when we put all of this confidence in these philosophical arguments, we may be missing, well, actually they break down. They don't work in and of themselves. So that's what I do with the Kalam cosmological argument, which many people would say, well, that's one of the finest, arguments. But it doesn't work philosophically. And of course, the problem in the Kalam argument is the human problem, that it's the universal problem.
Yeah, but you at the same time you would agree with someone like Francis Schaeffer that says that the Trinity is the answer to the one of the many dichotomy in philosophy, right? But is that answer something that's interesting to the Japanese people? I mean, in that way.
No, I don't think so. In other words, putting
Exactly.
the philosophical approach
Right.
is not interesting, but what I don't, to most people, but what is interesting is that there is the alienation that we feel, that is a byproduct of a failed humanness, a failed person, is, first of all, I think we have to identify that and say, describe this shame predicament. Not in this country, or maybe it's just the tradition I was raised in. It tended to be very rationalistic. But I think that we find more appealing the idea that, well, how does this address personhood? And of course, it's all about the personhood of Jesus Christ, because here is the one true person. Here is the humanness in its fullness and completion, That is, it's being completed within us in Christ. And so I think that's much more appealing.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, how does that, how were you able to tangibly, maybe you could give an illustration or analogy or whatever that comes to mind about how you're able to connect with folks in Japan on this level of dealing with this issue, like you said, of shame. And then maybe also could you explain how that's different from the guilt framework of Western Christian presentations? And not just Western, but just ones that are more mainstream.
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, Japanese, when you begin to describe shame, they immediately tune in because what we're saying about a shame understanding not just of human personality, but really the functioning of the culture, that it's group oriented. And what that means is that I have my identity primarily, my values and who I am. If you ask me, as a Japanese person, maybe the first thing I'd say is I'm Japanese, and then I'd tell you the company that I work for. I wouldn't tell you whether I was the janitor or the CEO. I'd just tell you the company. That is that we identify who we are. Now, I think that in this country, we may imagine that we are not that. But I think that's also a mistaken understanding of how, in fact, all people are really, in the end, we all are, the way that we become human, we're enculturated, we're socialized. And I think it's not the whole individualistic picture, I think is sometimes overstated. And so once you begin to talk this way and recognize that this is the way we have our value, and then you also recognize the way that the devastation of the falling out of the group or of being, forced out of the group, being excluded, being scapegoated. I'm convinced there's a very high suicide rate in Japan because it does function along the lines of, inside, outside. And the way you determine the inside is, well, there's always a scapegoated individual or scapegoated persons. And to become the scapegoat or to be cast out or just to get fired from your job, or by other means, it is devastating to people. And so these tensions that are very much on the surface in Japan, that is, that people go to great lengths to create group harmony, to be part of the group, uh, because that's understood. That's also a very high pressure way to live because there's always this intense, you know, focus on conformity, to be like everyone else. And so once you just describe, all I'm just describing the Japanese situation. But once you begin to describe that situation and you recognize, well, actually, this is the very problem that is being addressed in our being incorporated into the body of Christ, into an alternative identity that is no longer this kind of, uh, high pressure uh, conformity, but that we're delivered out of this shame sort of situation, that we are clothed. And this language of being clothed in Christ is thematic in Scripture. In other words, this is the picture of, that we are given the white robes of righteousness, that Christ, we're clothed in Christ, that we put on Christ. And the idea is the body of Christ, that we enter into this new social order, a new kingdom, a new people. And so when you begin to recognize that salvation is a deliverance out of this kind of hellish pressure of shame and, pride, and that we do in fact address the issues of shame and pride. And I think we can do that in some detail as to, The scriptures say that pride comes before a fall. That is, what is pride? Well, it's this construct. In Japanese term, pride is tatemae. Pride is my presentation of myself. That is maybe a different world than honne, than my inward self. And so there is a kind of built-in deceptiveness in the whole thing. And when we recognize, oh, that's precisely what is being addressed, that the truth of Christ addresses the lie of the human condition. And so that's my general approach. And actually, when you begin to look at it, then that's really an atonement theory. We're really describing a very different understanding of salvation than what you get in divine satisfaction. That penal substitution. That's more like a kind of Buddhist. There is a sense that people understand that, and it doesn't help.
Yeah.
Uh, and so Christianity, as it's often presented, does not address the lived reality of
Yeah.
people's problems and their need then to resolve neurosis. I mean, Japanese are some of the most neurotic. We may not recognize as are, Americans too, but the neurosis functions in a very different way, perhaps there.
What's
But
the different way that it functions? And, but before you go into there, I was just going to think, it sounds like the way in which you have found the gospel to be relevant for the Japanese is precisely in the apocalyptic sense of Christ, right? This unveiling is something that is very much needed in a culture that seems to be really caught up in saving face. Now we all are, so we always want to, just say that for folks who are confused if they're new. It's like we're not pointing our fingers at the Japanese by any means. We're just trying to
right, right. Yeah,
understand.
yeah.
We're trying to understand the relationship between why Christianity, which we find to be true and beautiful, and Japan, which seems to be so beautiful and so gorgeous and truthful in so many ways to people who look at it from afar, seem to not mix, right? And there's a lot of that in history we can get into, but just continue on the lines that we're at. Where do you go from there?
So yeah, I think the apocalypse, and what we mean by apocalyptic, the breaking in. There's this breaking in of revelation. There is a reordering of the world. Now, apocalyptic is not necessarily a destruction of culture, but it's a remaking. It's a recreation. And so it's not a purely negative thing, but I think that what we need to recognize, first of all, culture per se, or the human condition as we have it per se, is not really the ground that we're working on. This is the problem with a lot of missions in contextualization. Well, you want to contextualize well, that's partly true, but of course, ultimately, what the gospel is doing, and I think especially in an apocalyptic understanding, we recognize that the foundation of this thing is not the culture. And so we're going to have to be willing to critique and recognize the failings of the culture, whatever the culture is, and the way in which the gospel addresses that failing. I think every culture is a culture of death, but death and the death drive can manifest itself very differently. And so, yeah, I think that by apocalyptic, that's another way of saying holistic.
Yes, and this. Do they have a word for saving face similar to tatama? What did you say the word was? Tatame. That's
The
it.
Tatemae, yeah, is that the picture is that this is actually a lot of the novels that they focus upon the private. This is the interesting thing about the Japanese novel is that there suddenly is this exposure of a realm that I think before the advent of the modern novel didn't exist. In other words, it wasn't addressed. But suddenly, human interiority as a kind of end in itself became the focus in the Japanese novel. I mean, in this country, in movies and that, we just take that for granted, that human interiority or human suffering. But that kind of opened up this realm. Uh, I don't know that, one of the highest suicide rates among Japanese is actually among novelists or among writers. And I think it's precisely here because there is a kind of value that's put upon this interior suffering per se, as if that has some inherent meaning. So uh, again, this is a mixture, the Shi Shosetsu, the I novel, is actually the byproduct of the entry of the confession, Christianity or Catholicism coming in. And so this idea of the confessional didn't necessarily directly have anything to do, but a lot of the people that became key writers and thinkers in Japan, though they may not, well, they usually weren't Christian, some were, but nonetheless, many of them had exposure to Christianity, and this aspect I think was
That's
brought.
interesting because, and I do like looking at these things as without the theological lens, to just look at the anthropological effects of Christianity encountering a society that had been so isolated and able to preserve itself so seemingly well with order and everything, with a kind of what I would say is a well tuned sacrificial machine that allows people to kind of self select and sacrifice themselves out of the system with um, seppuku, and then you got these more modern forms of, like you were talking about, being fired and all these things of this kind of a well-oiled sacrificial machine, and it has its own beauty and order and structure to it. But yet there's this encounter with this foreign, you know, concept, so to speak, of Christianity coming in. And maybe you could get into that a little bit, the history, because you've told me before that the concept, the modern Japanese identity, you believe is a product of a kind of collective immune response to Christianity, right?
Yeah, there's no question that the Meiji Restoration was, this is just there in the government records. And I know this because my nephew, who is a professor at Amherst University, while I was in Japan, he was doing his PhD research, and he is fluent in Japanese, but he's also fluent in ancient Japanese. And so he was going to the Diet and actually reading the records from the Meiji Restoration. So I'm not speaking in some abstraction, but no, they were concerned to reduplicate something on the order of the British Empire, in which the king is the head of state and the head of the church. And so they needed a religion or an identity. And actually, identity is the key word here, because religion is shukyo is a new word in Japanese. This gets, unless you have a little know a little bit about the way religion usually functions, it's not really an entity apart. Shukyo and the religion, those both then talk about religion as an entity apart. But actually, the way that religion functions in most cultures is just part of the identity of the national or tribal or group identity. And you don't really
Yes.
think of the religion as a separate area. But the Japanese began to recognize that they needed a kind of religious backing, or that in some way that they needed to create an identity. And part of the goal was to ward off the West. In other words, this is the time when Admiral Perry had come in with his gunboats, and literal physical, colonization was the danger, the fear. And the fear was they would Christianize the country and then colonize the country, which is not unwarranted fear. And so the ideology that developed the national ethos, we might call it, was very much a product of meetings that were held in the Meiji Restoration and leading, they continued to debate the role of Buddhism and Shintoism, and each was given a place. But if you had to say what was ultimately happening, they were structuring or creating a national identity that was by definition over and against that foreign Christian identity that was seen as a threat. Now, I think we could, people would say, well, that was, 100 years ago or more. And yeah, that's true. It certainly shifted. But I think that's had a lasting impact. That is, that things that we might take for granted, like the language. Japanese people speak the Japanese language. Well, even a simple statement like that was not true before Meiji because there was no necessary unified structure. Okinawa and Kagoshima and Hokkaido, they would have had, even to call it dialect, probably, in other words, these people didn't necessarily understand each other. But one of the things that happens then is that there is the creation of a uniform language. So too with the religion. You have Shintoism, but that doesn't really tell you the religion that existed in Hokkaido and the religion that was there in Kagoshima. So there was they literally sent out, they called them, the same word as we use for missionaries. They sent out envoys from the central government to unify the religion and the religious practices. So when I say the word Shinto, this now seems to apply to the whole country, but only because there was a forced unification in state Shinto. And so one of the things that happens in state Shinto is that, and this certainly was not true of the native religion, was that Shintoists don't generally do anything with death or funerals. Well, that's because the Meiji, they began to just give that to the Buddhists. And so death is handled by the Buddhists, birth and marriage by Shinto. And so everything is unified, and it's all unified in an ideology. This ideology today, we might call it, you know, prior to the war, just kind of wartime, nationalism. But the word in Japanese is Nihonjinron. And there's a whole literature, a whole body of literature that is produced primarily by big business. In other words, the right-wing interests in any culture are generally the moneyed interests. And that's true in Japan. There's a moneyed interest in creating an identity. And this is the literature in Japan that tells Japanese what it means to be Japanese. And I think that then is on a continuum with what happened in the Meiji Restoration.
So when you talk about that force, is it in decline, that Meiji Restoration identity that is, in your view? And you're not saying this is an abstract, you're saying this is literally what they say. If you look at the documents, designed as an immune response to repel the contagion of Christianity spreading and taking hold, such that the Japan that they want to preserve can be unified and strong against Western imperialism. And would you say that whole cultural identity is in decline, or is it just kind of chugging along pretty okay, or is there something else emerging in recent years or decades? Or
Yeah, I think that to say that it's static would be wrong. Of course, I've been gone 20 years too. But even while I was there, I lived in a very, scuba science city. It is a very cosmopolitan city. And a lot of these guys are scientists. And what it means to be a scientist is they're going to have to, many of them have lived overseas. Many of them speak English. And so there is a kind of just that thing that I just said 50 years ago, or going back to the 1950s, 1960s in Japan, there was a very small cultural elite that had exposure to other countries. They were not cosmopolitan. Japan was still very isolated. And so there was still this kind of identity, that was over and against, that a lot of stuff that I wrote several things on a guy who was a brain researcher in Japan and talked about how studying English will cause brain damage in Japanese children, or how listening to foreign music. I don't think it's that extreme. He at one time was the most well-known scientist in Japan, Tadanobu Tsunoda. And his book on Nihonjinron, that is the Japanese brain, probably was one of the best-selling books in science in Japan. And he was extremely right-wing, in trying to, but who, by the way, I met him and talked to him. He strangely enough, was very fluent in English. But his experiments,
That was quite a sacrifice for him to engage in English with you. Then that was causing.
yeah, no, he was he was a gracious guy. He tried to get me fired from my job, but other than that, he was a gracious guy.
Why did he? Are you able to share about that, or is that too long?
Yeah, no, I had written some articles on him, and the articles were how publications will pick up an abstract of an article, and some magazine that does that and just summarizes articles. They picked up the article that I'd written, and they gave it a new title. They called it "Why Japanese Read Comic Books." And that was not the name of my article, but anyway, he got kind of angry that and I didn't reduce it to that, but that was one of the things that he had said that was kind of I thought a kind of silly thing. And that is that Japanese, when they finish work at the end of the day, because they are left brain dominant, they have worn out their left brain and they need to rest. And one of the ways of giving the left brain rest is to read Japanese anime, the comic books. That's why you see adults, everybody on the trains, at least then, would have these comic books. And he said that's because Western adults they don't appreciate the anime because they're not their language is it doesn't function in the same way. So that was, this journal picked it up and was obviously a simplification of his theory. Although his book, he wrote a popular level book in Japanese in which he said very much that he kind of claimed that in he did an English version of his book, but in the English version of his book, he didn't, it was more scientifically, he said wild things in the Japanese book. Like, the reason the Japanese did so poorly in the Olympics in the 60s was because of overexposure to foreign languages and foreign cultures. And this literally had a physiological effect on Japanese. And so they weren't able to run as fast or jump as high. And so there was a literal kind of physiological brain damage that comes from too much Western exposure. So
that's probably the case on some level. I mean, I've certainly noticed after I drank too much Diet Coke, I got something called Rumsfeld disease. Sometimes it's hard to remember things, like Donald Rumsfeld was involved with the creation of aspartame. So there's got to be something with language here too.
I'm not, and that's the thing about Tsunoda, and about, there's a lot of things happening in Nihon. This would be a part of the Nihonjinron literature, this genre. In talking about it this way, it may sound like I'm just completely dismissive, but actually I'm not. I can't refute his experimental method. I don't know that there's not legitimacy to it, but I can dispute his interpretation. And I think that's the thing. You know, you could say the same thing about a lot of the monkey experiments that took place down at Kyoto University. It may be, in fact, that that Japanese did discover a new form of evolution. I don't know that that's not true, but the interpretation that they put upon this was to link the Japanese people and the natural world in Japan, to say that the Japanese people are the most unique people in the world because they live in these islands that have four seasons in which it's a temperate climate, and it has produced a very unique people. In other words, it may be that some of the science is legitimate. I don't know. But the interpretation, the nationalistic interpretation, from a Western perspective, and even as I say this, this is strange. When I went to see Tsunoda, he showed me Western journals, scientific, psychological journals that had picked up his work, and to show me that his method was accepted in the West. And of course, again, the Western scientists would be some of the last to understand the nationalistic interpretation that he was putting upon this. So, in this sense, those people who did not understand Nihonjinron or understand the conversation were the least prepared to recognize what it is that they were dealing with in somebody like Tsunoda. So that's very often what happens in the case of Japan.
Well, I mean, I don't blame,
Uh,
I don't blame
if
people.
I may interject, it seems to me that the Japanese they want to maintain a higher percentage of stress based living and a minimal percentage of catharsis. Like what you just described, Dr. Axton, is that they don't. They say that the people in the West don't appreciate anime enough because they don't. They have not been under the same level of stress like the Japanese people often are under. So that may come across as reflective in the language. Like I've looked at some of the a little bit of the Japanese language, and it seems like they are the vowels, the alphabets are very designed to be very precise, very orderly, as opposed to the very fluid way of the Western language. Like it may seem that Western languages they might have a point in that the Western languages are very much less rigid, very casual, because it has evolved throughout the years, and it has been you could probably say it has been Christianized a lot, in the sense that there is a less emphasis on rigidity in Christian cultures than it's in non-Christian cultures. Uh,
Yes, yeah, I think you're exactly right. Yeah. The language in Japan is very structured. And so it's a very neat language in that you know what to say in any situation because the formula is there. And so that's sort of true. Yeah, what you're saying, it's a highly structured culture. It's a highly structured language in its writing. Now, that may be taken too far sometimes because, of course, the writing system is Chinese, actually. that has been adapted to Japanese, the kanji, the writing system. But I'm curious though about the picture that I've painted about shame. How does that compare to India?
I think there are a lot of similarities. Of course, India, like Japan, is highly collective. And I must confess, I haven't been to Japan, but what little I know of Japan is I've from reading books and, of course, the internet. So it seems like Japanese, how they justify their collectivism is a very similar to how Indians justify their collectivism, their group, their like, identity, as you describe it,
Mm.
is that they feel that this is like if they discard this collective way of living, then their entire existence is threatened. The way the Japanese seem to justify it is that they are in a very specific location on this earth, and they are highly prone to things like natural disasters. And if they are not highly organized, and if they are not ordered, living in a very orderly way, then they may pay much more of a cost than what they are paying already in when they are threatened by things like natural disasters. And I'm sure that people in India have a similar kind of justification. Of course, it's not natural disasters, it might be something else like invasions from other nations, because India has been invaded so long by various groups of people. So that sort of like uh, causes a culture to silo in on its boundaries, taboos, things like that. It's certainly the case, like in the case of persecution against Christians that we see in India. It's the case that it doesn't matter whether it is a right thing or a wrong thing. It matters if that thing, which is Christianity, if it's threatening this current way of existence or not.
Yeah.
And people in India, especially the Hindu nationalists, have rightly identified Christianity as something that has potential to usurp the current way of existence. Like things like the caste system will vanish overnight, and things like gender discrimination and other things, like regional specific way of living. Like there are many languages in India, and that's sort of like if Christianity arrives, then what Christianity often causes in cultures is that it creates a kind of unified, homogeneous language system.
Mhm.
And yeah, I would say there are similarities in that sense.
Yeah, no, what you're saying is that you're exactly right. I mean, this is the monsters, King Kong, Godzilla, coming in and destroyed. There is there's
Yeah.
this feeling that things are very fragile. The other thing that popped in my mind as you were describing, one of the favorite places in Japan is Tokyo Disneyland. Disneyland is like a microcosm of the country. It's run by a kind of ruling elite and the very strict rules, very clean, very orderly. It's kind of the perfect model. Actually, we came to American LA Disneyland. We were disappointed. Uh, at things were old and dirty and run down. So no, I think you're hitting it. And I think also that we Japanese, of course, what you're saying, they would not like this, and that is to say, well, there are characteristics in Japan that are not unique to Japanese, but are just unique to Southeast Asia and Asian countries in this kind of group oriented, even in specifics. I don't know, David, if I've talked to you about Amae and Amaeru, kind of the way that the indulgence of the child by the mother and the mother focus. I've read stuff, and maybe this is true in India.
So could
Yeah.
you explain that further, what you're saying with the mother thing?
That there, in other words, if you had to say, what is the primary structure of the human psyche? Takeo Doi, who's a psychoanalyst, has traced it to what he calls the anatomy of Amae. And Amae is just this relationship between mother and child, in which the child is totally indulged by the mother. And the father is kind of the foreign, figure kind of intruding upon this relationship. So that there is the feeling of being one melding with mother, of a kind of, a preservation of childishness in as a good thing, a kind of total dependence upon mother, upon the feminine, and a kind of seeing the masculine. I'm just describing Doi now. The masculine as an intrusion. And so Doi takes this and ties it to Buddhism, you know, and of course, in a Western idea, if you would go to a psychologist or a counselor and you describe this total dependence on mother, well, of course, they'd try to cure you of that dependence. But the idea is in Japan, and even in Japanese, I mean, there's not a lot of counseling, but even in Japanese psychology, rather than discouraging, there is an encouragement of amaeru, of this dependence. So much so that Doi says that perfect amae is found in nirvana. In other words, total dependence upon mother ultimately translates into melding and being one with Mother Earth. What he seems to be describing, I think he is describing in point blank, is death. That there is a squelching. That's part of the Amae. There is the squelching of the individual, a melding with the mother, the feminine, and a doing away with ego.
Yes, I recently was reading Shushaku Endo's last novel, Deep River, and that novel is about a group of Japanese who are visiting India. They're visiting the holiest place in India, which is Varanasi, that right beside the river Ganges. And the one very particular scene from that novel struck me, which sounds exactly like what you are describing, and which is one of the Japanese tourists comes across this ancient statue of an Indian goddess called Chamunda, or like a variation of the goddess Kali. So uh, that Japanese tourist was pointing out how similar the maternal goddess figure is to the Japanese notion of maternity, where the statue is depicted with breasts from which the entire world feeds, and because of that constant feeding of that the breastfeeding from the entire world, the goddess is shown to be very shriveled and almost like a skeletal figure. So it's almost looked as a kind of like a self-sacrificial kind of motif for maternity. I'm
Oh,
sure the Japanese may see it in a similar way as well.
that's perfect. That's exactly it. In other words, a good mother is the sacrificial mother, the mother who lays, she does everything for her child. That the idea is that this is the role of a good mother. Uh, and the maternal, of course, is ultimately translated into nature. I get that a little bit in the feeling of the Ganges and the way that, there's a return to. So very similar idea in Nirvana, at least in the way that Doi is describing it.
Yeah, it's and I think this is one of the reasons. I'm not sure 100% about this, but I'm not sure what other Japanese intellectuals say. But Shushaku Endo argues that the reason why Christianity did not take root in Japan as strongly as it was expected to is because the Christianity that was presented to Japan was presented in a very patristic way. It's
Yeah,
like presented in a very patriarchal way. I'm not 100% sure whether other Japanese intellectuals share the same sentiment, but his idea was that if Jesus was presented as as a kind of maternal figure to Japanese, it might have resonated more. That's like ultimately like if you I'm sure you have come across his novel Silence,
yeah.
and there's one character in that novel where the Japanese person who is often, and this is of course historically very debatable, how many Japanese apostatized, but one Japanese character in that novel, he was eager, like he had no problem stepping on that stone, the fumie, I believe it's called,
Uh-huh.
and but he thought it was okay as long as he confessed his sins to the priest who was the protagonist in that story. So what Endo was trying to say there was that the Japanese would actually feel much more at home if they looked at the priest as a kind of forgiving, as a kind of maternal figure, as opposed to a disciplinary figure, which I guess it would make sense because the Japanese are very used to a kind of overbearing, orderly kind of way of existence, which they probably attribute to the fatherly figure. So it's like they're yearning out for a maternal kind of a forgiveness, or in other words, the grace of God.
That's it. And of course, the debate here, Shusaku Endo in the novel, if you remember, at one point, the Fumie cries out and begins to speak. And of course, the voice that is being spoken, it sounds very much like the voice of the Japanese mother. And
Yeah.
that is step on me, step on me. That's why I came into the world to be trodden on by men. Well, uh, it's a kind of, I mean, in one sense, it may in fact appeal to the ethos that is there in Japan, but of course, and I do think that we need to get away from a patriarchal understanding of God, this kind of punishing figure. But I also think that there is a kind of masochism that is involved in Amae and Amaedu that is also highly destructive. And I think that's ultimately the problem. It's not, that this Amae may in fact not describe the reality that it plays, but the question is, should it play this strong role? And should we shape our understanding of Christianity in such a way that we completely adapt? In other words, I'm not saying we can't adopt, we can't portray a more maternalistic understanding, but the problem is this role of mother becomes all consuming. The mother in this understanding is almost, there's a whole genre of literature in Japan searching for mother because, the return, in Freudian terms to the womb is really a kind of impossibility. It's a kind of death in and of itself, in which you would give up the reality of who and what you are in order for this kind of maternalistic escape.
So there's
Yeah.
let me try to summarize this trajectory between the Japanese culture that is set up to guard against the Western imperialism, and then all the things, World War II, the dropping of the bomb, all of this pain and suffering in a different way, and then this need to, I guess, kind of save face and adopt American style capitalism and technology races that catapults Japan so fast, like a skyrocket from destruction into a major world player. And then what you see today is this, like, again, it is like this overbearing, mothering baby culture that they have been so good at developing and distributing, of Hello Kitty and Tamagotchi and Pikachu, and then you go on and watch the TV and the TV shows that they watch, and it's all about kind of like fixation on childishness stuff, little childish antics where it's all about shame and someone's pants falls down and they all laugh, and you're thinking to yourself, how did you go from stoic samurai and shogun to watching people have their pants pulled down like this is third grade, and this is adults, and this is major primetime television content in Japan, and again, how do you go there and yet you're also successful at this? And it sounds like it's almost like this kind of infantilization. It's this kind of reaction to the stoic saving face grit that has to be done in order to kind of grin and bear it, the suffering that they've gone through, right? And it has to come out on the other end of this kind of entertainment soft belly that manifests. And then you see that with manga and anime, where there's this fixation on new bow designs, and some kind of pretty strange stuff that you get into with some of the stuff in anime. Is that somehow connected to their ability to get through the kind of loss of honor that happens with the humiliation of the defeat with World War II, and then the need to kind of, well, if we can't, if we can't beat them, we're going to be them, and we're going to be them better than they are, and but yet at the same time we're longing for mother, which is kind of that return to the innocence of the past, right?
Yeah, maybe Yukio Mishima is the key figure here, and just as an illustration of the tensions that you're talking about. And that is that, he always just wanted to be a writer, and he began writing. But of course, writing, this may sound strange in a Western context, but it's attached to a kind of feminine art in Japan. And his father wanted a man's man. He wanted an engineer, somebody who would play. And all Mishima wanted to do was write. And so he began to write in secret. And the only person that he would show his writing to was his mother. And she always saw the first draft of anything. And the early scene, his father came in and found him writing and tore it up and, yelled at him. And so he always had this split between his father and mother, and they're very upper class. And so Mishima is kind of a celebrity in Japan. And you can go online and find photographs of his transformation. That in the post-war period, and he runs this down in Sun and Shield, is the psych. He's always a very tortured individual, and his writing, the thing that he's writing about is this kind of interior torture. This, and to call it sexual may miss that it may sound more pornographic there's a lot of sex involved, but it's a kind of twisted, you know, incapacity for, you know, the one friend that he has in a novel, and he kisses the woman and he says, well, it's like kissing my sister or something. And so he wants to transform himself from the world of his mother, the world of writing, to the world of his father. And so he begins to lift weights and he muscles up, you know. He poses with a sword. You can find these poses. He starts his own little army to create something worth dying for, because he feels like in World War II, he missed the opportunity to die for the emperor. And now they're, you know, we in the post-war period, they've kind of lost this masculine opportunity. And he wants to recreate this possibility. Two things are happening. Mishima is telling us this story, but he's also letting us in on the fact that the whole point is for him to kill himself. The whole point is for him, in other words, he literally can't live with the torture that he feels, and you feel it. I mean, that's part of this. The reading his novels is not a fun experience because you feel the suffering, and I think we all can kind of understand the suffering. We're not unacquainted with the kind of thing that he's describing, of being eaten away by words, that this, you know, just being plagued by, you know, his own thought life. The thing that is torturing him is his own mind. He can't endure it. He wants to destroy it. And the way he's going to destroy it is by entering the world of his father. And so this is the scene, you know, he goes into, I think the guy's name was General Mashita. He and one of his cohorts. And you could go on YouTube and still see Mishima talking on the roof of the self-defense forces. He's giving this speech. You really can't hear him because the news helicopters are flying around. But anyway, he's trying to encourage the self-defense forces to rise up and put the emperor back, you know, restore the dignity of Japan, restore the dignity of the emperor. And they're just laughing at him. You know, they think he's a comical figure. Uh, and so he goes back in, you know, he's on a roof and he goes back. There's a window there at level with him. He goes back into the office. They have the general tied up. They didn't hurt him. But anyway, he commits seppuku, which, you know, he runs the sword into his belly. And theoretically, the second is supposed, when you do that, the second is supposed to decapitate you. But of course, none of them are really samurai, and the guy can't get his head chopped off. And it takes several, you know, has to whack his neck there. It used to be on Look magazine. There's a picture of Mishima in that office, his head laying next to his torso. I think in other words, there's so many things happening, but he's destroying one world in order to attain another world. But there is the sense that it involves his own destruction. And the emperor stuff, the masculine stuff, in a sense, is kind of a masochistic excuse for his own end, his own self-destruction. These worlds don't fit together, but what I would say about it is, yeah, but that's not just Japan. In other words, we're all torn in this way, but not everybody is a genius like Mishima and can articulate. Most of us can't articulate this thing that's torturing us. But he did, and he does it quite brilliantly. And so it's horrible literature to read, but it has great insight, I think, into the very thing that you're describing, this world of contrast, you know, between the kind of the cute, childlike world of mother and the masculine world that is there in business and really in school. By the time you pass, this is really the big jolt in Japan. As long as you're, before junior high, you're still kind of treated like a child. But junior high is very torturous, and from then on, it's a kind of that there is this strong uh, conversion, you might say, from the one world of mother, the world of the child, into the world of the father, the public school, the life in public. And it's a very difficult transition.
I think you might be right in a sense when you say Yukio Mishima is the key here, because it seems like what you described about the life of Mishima is that he was grasping for something that we all might be grasping for, and that is a fatherly figure who has the ability to forgive with the grace of God, which is often attributed in many cultures to the feminine. That Christ might be Yukio Mishima perfected. One of the reasons I believe that I think I might be correct here, but one of the reasons he committed seppuku is that he felt that his work was complete, and his work, which was the tetralogy of the series of novels that he wrote, uh, he felt that that was his gift to Japan, and Christ, in that sense, like he gave us the gift of salvation, and he also died in a perfected self-sacrificial way. And this is one of the beauties of Christianity, is that Christ comes in masculine form, which is the masculine form is often attributed to over disciplinary characteristics we find in many cultures, India and Japan among them. And but he comes in a masculine form, and he dispenses mercy and forgiveness, which is attributed to the feminine of many cultures. So he kind of like in his personhood, he kind of solves that dilemma that many cultures face, which between the patriarchal and the matriarchal. And
Yeah, beautifully said. Beautifully said.
Yeah, I think it's a great conversation. We got to kind of land the plane here for now, but we've certainly set the table for future conversations to dive into some of these ideas. And I was thinking of that too, of the where is the place for Christ amongst a society that is so, you know, death driven in a way that we can see that we also, or all cultures are, but there's there's a big sloppy Joe of America with all of its encounterings with Christianity and different sects and all these different, that makes it a little bit more complicated to untangle. But with Japan, you have almost a case study of a pretty well preserved, well ordered sacrificial machine tending to the more pagan past of all humankind, still kind of chugging along in the modern sense, still kind of throwing off the yoke of Christianity, especially in a metaphysical conversion. But yet you see these Christ hauntings dripping around on the edges, like you said, with this. You talked about the novelists themselves and the confessional, and I think that's where all the weird stuff gets to hang out a little bit, right? As long as we're super left brain oriented in our structure, we can let it all hang out a little bit in a private manga or something we're watching on the subway, right? And that whole kind of tension. I've had Ian McGilchrist on my show about the master and his emissary, the right hemisphere and the left brain, and how there's this distortion that's taken place in the West, becoming more left hemisphere dominant to the point where it casts out the right hemisphere, which is this holistic approach. And maybe in Japan's attempt to mimetically, you know, compete with America because they had to. They were subjugated, they were conquered, and they had to kind of, all right, these are the terms. We're going to do the best we can within this framework and still be proud of our Japanese culture. They had to kind of imitate that left hemisphere dominance to a degree that has cast out that right hemisphere holistic approach that they yearn for. But
yeah, maybe I may have, in other words, I in that story, I may have, in other words, they're all, what was Tsunoda is also talking about is that there is a perfect balance in the Japanese brain. I mentioned the left brain but of course the manga are playing into the right brain. And so there is this fullness of the right brain, supposedly, that is absent, Tsunoda would say, in a left brain dominant, but that then is what is rested, or that's why he actually says that's why Japanese sleep on trains.
Interesting. Is that the I wanted to ask you if that, with that context, why has some of the best Japanese, there's a lot of series. You got that Evangelion series that's very popular and iconic that deals with some Christian themes. You've got The Legend of Zelda, created by Shigeru Miyamoto, one of the most popular video game franchises in the whole world. Originally had all these deep Christian symbolism and, Triforce, Trinity, and all these crosses on the shields of Link, who is pursuing this battle for the Zelda character, who is this kind of princess, like you can see it like Christ and is pursuing his bride, and the Trinity. I mean, it's a video game, but the point is, you have that. You have shows like Ghost movies like Ghost in the Shell, iconic worldwide, wrestling with Christian themes. The creator of which was a Christian in his earlier years. You have the Osamu Tezuka, who created this many different series. He's considered the Walt Disney of Japanese animation, and he even created a series in the 80s called In the Beginning, which was this cartoon anime series on the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
So what, with their well-preserved, well-oiled identity kind of keeping Christianity at bay, how do you account for these encounters, these major franchise encounters with playing with Christian themes? Is it do we just dismiss it as, well, it's just a kind of a exotic thing that's happened? They're just interested in the exotic foreignness of Christianity. They're just playing with it on a superficial level, but I don't think that's probably accurate. I think there's something deeper going on.
Yeah, and I'm always afraid that I'm not dismissive of the things that in other words, that is there a deep appreciation for nature, I don't want to dismiss that or in any way denigrate that understanding. Oh, that's true in Japan. There is this lovely, beauty in the culture, and you've got to deeply appreciate that. But also you don't want to fall into romanticizing it. In other words, there needs to be a kind of balance, but nonetheless, I think a deep appreciation for the culture and recognize, there may in fact be a depth of understanding here uh, that explores the world and understands the world that is very different. And we need, at the same time, we don't want to be romanticizing or uncritical. We can also be highly appreciative.
Well, thank you for your time, sir. It's always great to talk with both of you individuals, and I do want to have you on again, Dr. Paul Axton. It'd be great to have you again.
It was so good. It was so good to meet you. Remind me your first name?
Surit.
Suid?
Surit.
Okay. Well, it was so good to meet you, and hope we can. David, thank you for the conversation. Always happy to talk.
Thank you. And we'll put a link to your podcast so people can connect with your show too.
Okay, good deal. Great talking.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.